Okay, it's 5:10. I think we can start. Welcome everyone to Great Talks. This is the new platform of Greycells to share and exchange views on development topics. And now this COVID-19 is changing all thinkings and all actions in almost every developmental field. And we are very happy, I'm particularly very happy to have Jean-Victor Gruat today with us, sharing his insights on the Chinese experience. We're going to see it later. Maybe he doesn't remember, but I met for the first time Jean-Victor Gruat 30 years ago, 1990, when I joined the Social Security Department at the ILO, and he was already the Director of Policy at the Social Security Department over there. I immediately was very impressed with Jean-Victor because he is a polyglot. He speaks Spanish better than myself, Russian, English, French, and Chinese now. So it is really amazing. And he writes perfectly and in all languages, And also I was also very impressed all along our joint adventure at the ILO because he doesn't only have ideas and he writes his ideas, but he has a very extensive field experience. And last but not least, I had the privilege to write a document which was possibly one of my best sellers together with him, which I have the title over here. It was a little bit long. It was Social Protection, a Life Cycle Continuum Investment for Social Justice, Poverty Alleviation, and Sustainable Development. That was jointly, if you Google Gruat and Bonilla, you will get the document in English, French, and Spanish. So I am very proud of that and very happy to have him here. Besides being the Director of Policy at the ILO, he was the Director of ILO in Moscow and the Director of ILO in Beijing. And since 2007, he leads projects of the European Union in China. And of course, Jean-Victor shared a document with us and he will take us by the hand to see what happened in China, but also share with us his insights on why did everything happen. He's supporting all his ideas and expressed in the document with some statistics that he got, and also with constant, possibly daily contacts in China to get updated. So he shared with us already in his document very interesting information and statistical data that to many I have received comments from Mexico and from Turkey. They cannot understand. They would like to know why. Why is it that now 90% of business is already open in China? And why is it that Beijing, with a city of 21 million people, only had 580 cases and only 8 deaths? Many people say, what is that real? How did they do it? So these and many other things, I'm sure that Jean-Victor will help us to understand and assess. So thank you very much for being with us today. And Jean-Victor, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Alejandro. And it's true that we have been friends for so many decades that it's a life. I mean, it's a life we have spent together, in fact. Now, I don't want to use too much of your time in preliminaries, but you know I love you very much, Alejandro. And thanks for inviting me here. The purpose of the presentation, now I'm sharing, trying to share a screen with you. The purpose of this talk, let's say, is not to have you listen from a specialist in pandemics or in politics or in futurology or whatever, but just to have some insight from someone who has been involved in China matters for the last 30 years or so, and who sometimes feels people with less frequent contacts with these countries have difficulties understanding what really happens to it. So I am stranded out of China since mid-January. I could not come back, and I don't think I will be able to return to my home in the very, very near future. But I have a few sources I can use to keep abreast of the situation and the evolution of this situation. There is one excellent website which is called the Beijinger.com, and this is for foreigners. It's in English, and it gives a lot of daily information on what happens in Beijing related to COVID-19 plus statistics, and anyone can access this, and it's quite useful. Now I also have daily contacts with my friends in China, and this also helps me understand a lot. I can tell you, if you're interested, of course, that today hairdressers are reopening in Beijing, as well as massage and beauty salons, and the schools will reopen on 27 April. These were the last news. There are two other type of documents I felt could be interesting to share with you. One is a compendium of all actions taken by the Chinese government since, let's say, late December until end of March. This compendium was made by the China news agency, Xinhua, and of course it's in Chinese, right? But I translated, I mean, Google translated it for me in English, and I put a link to a website so that everyone can access this. It's 32 pages document, but I think it's worth reading. And then there is a website which provides the evolution of the COVID-19 disease in all affected or most of the affected countries in a dynamic way, and I will come back to this later. At the suggestion of Alejandro, I will limit my introduction to three topics, which I call the 3 R's here. One is, why was China perhaps more ready than other countries to confront the epidemic? Second, what about the Chinese data? And third, can China use this crisis to increase its global influence? But of course, first I thought it was useful to make a very brief introduction on what happened. This I took from the compendium, right, from the 32 pages, and it's 10 items. It's on 30 December that the Wuhan health authorities issued guidance on how to deal with what they call the cluster of pneumonia with unknown causes. And it was already considered, 30 December, right? Considered very serious by Taiwan, since from 31 December, Taiwan stopped its direct daily flights from Wuhan. They understood immediately. Others, it took them longer time to understand. So 30 December, after New Year, Western New Year, 3 January, China started communicating with WHO and informed its partners, including the US government, about the situation in Wuhan. It's on 15 January that the situation started being handled centrally, with the Chinese National Health Commission issuing its first diagnosis and treatment plan for the COVID. There have been altogether, I think, 5 plans until now. The first case from the US was notified to China on 22 January 2020. This is 3 months ago. The quarantine in Wuhan city started on 23 January, and it's on 26 January that you hear a Chinese way of calling things. 6 public prevention guidelines means everything related to confinement started on 26 January across the country. And it's also on that very date that the National Health Commission of China informed the international community that silent carriers, which is the people who are infected but don't show any symptoms, that silent carriers could transmit the virus. Now, this was the early stages. It's on 24 March, which is a little bit then less months, than 3 months later, that the National Health Commission considered that the spread of domestically transmitted cases was blocked and the outbreak was controlled in China. Meanwhile, the situation dramatically evolved in the rest of the world, and now if we talk about virus prevalence, there are 6 countries besides China which have 80,000 plus declared cases. The countries are listed here, but you know them. And this, I come to the dynamics of the situation. This was the situation on 1st March, right? China was, in this type of graph, almost the only country showing a significant level of infection. As a matter of fact, they accounted for 80,000 out of 88,000, which is 90% of the declared cases. And the only countries with significant numbers were Korea, South Korea, Italy, and Iran in a certain manner. This was 1 March. 15 March, it starts moving. And Italy shows already a significant number of cases, but China is still a long, long way ahead of the others. 15 March is the time where in France we started taking things seriously, where bars and restaurants closed, if you remember this. 31 March, China is becoming a country like the others. I stopped at 31 March because this is the time I made the graph. But you see the situation in this box as of today. There are 1st of April, there were 800,000 cases. Now it's 2.5 times as much, 1.9 million. And China has not changed a lot. It's still 83,000. But the rest of the world now accounts for a far broader percentage of the total infection. So apparently China was ready, but what made it ready? For me, this is a very personal interpretation, right? It's my analysis of the situation, and I may be completely wrong. But I shared it with Chinese friends, and they didn't seem to say that this was the case. I mean, that I was wrong. So 10 factors, right? China has a previous experience in handling health crisis situation. We all remember about the SARS, and this was in 2003. And the experience, unfortunate experience China had at that time, they built upon it to prepare for a next pandemic that would occur. Other countries have had experiences of pandemic later, and with the H1N1 virus starting from Mexico and spreading mostly to the US. But I'm not convinced the lessons from this experience were drawn equally well. 2, China has a sustainable government priority for public health. Over the last 20 years, the percentage of public health in the Chinese GDP has been growing twice faster, which is at a pace of 30% per year. And you can imagine what this represents after 20 years. I'm not sure here again then that in other parts of the world, the same level of priority has been attached to this sector of social welfare. 3rd, full responsiveness to directive by the population. And this is linked to the next factor, China still have very structured communities to implement decisions. I don't detail all this because in the document you can download there are a number of illustrations of these different factors. Now the following points are known, sorry. Individual protection and indispensable equipments were available and they were used by the population. There is a very solid virtual networking to ensure continuity in monitoring and liaison. In China, you don't have any big questions about are you followed, are your itineraries on your cell phone followed by the authorities, etc., etc. It has been like this for as long as cell phones have existed. So the very right questions which are asked in our countries over there, it's not a point, at least for the general people. There is a dynamic social response. There is a role to play for each and for all persons in China. And this is not only in times of epidemics or crises. At all points in times, you see the elder persons, those who in France we confine at home, you see the elders on the street, helping the others, queuing for the bus, explaining the itineraries, etc., etc. China, and this may be important, has an established practice of social and other distancing. In China, you don't shake hands, you don't hug, you don't kiss, right? This may play a role. And then you have an action-oriented government. When it's, let's say, normal times, normal issues, decision may take a long time to be made in China because there is a lot of discussion, a debate of exchange. Everyone needs to agree. There are back and forth discussions. But when it's needed, decisions come. And they can come several times a year. Several times a day. Depending, for example, on how many people, when the sun is coming, how many people go to the parks, portions of the park may be closed immediately. It's decided like this by the local authorities who have the power to do so. And of course, there was a clear and easily understood government strategy, which was to test symptoms on everyone. Immediately when a symptom is detected, to isolate the person, to isolate the group to which the person belongs, to bring the person to the hospital, and to keep this person until she's fully cured. This is a very clear and understood strategy. Now, what about Chinese data? The Chinese data, COVID data, they were not questioned immediately. They started being questioned when the US outranked China as the most affected countries. Other countries also have good results in treating the epidemics. And here I just listed three: Germany, Austria, South Korea. Could list more, right? But these figures in these countries are not challenged. It is true that though practically no country has official comprehensive data concerning cases or even concerning deaths, right? In France, we have, I don't know how many now, let's say 100,000 cases, but there is a common understanding among specialists that the population actually infected may be of some 1.6 million persons. We had for a long time a certain number of deaths, and then suddenly, one day, someone said, oh yes, but we don't count all dead persons. We just forgot those in the retirement home. Overnight, our number of deaths doubled. So figures everywhere are a little bit questionable. What matters is the trend, of course. And as was written by the national correspondent of Le Monde newspaper, the French newspaper Le Monde in China. He wrote, if the hospitals in Shanghai or Beijing had been overflown by sick persons, this would not have gone unnoticed. Right? This is the fact. Now, when you talk with Chinese people, when I talk with my Chinese friends, the thing they ask me to add to my presentation is that although they are very proud that everyone mobilized for Wuhan and that all China supported Wuhan and that these efforts have been successful, they feel very sorry that time was lost until the central government took over from the local authorities. Because China functions on the basis of aggregation of data. Data start from locally and they progress and they reach the center. Some leaders may tend to under-report because they believe this would improve their status with central authorities. And this is a real problem. It's not new in China. It dates back from the period where Mao Zedong and the Chinese party, Communist Party, just fixed very, very ambitious targets onto the local unit. And what was important for any local leader was to show that the target was met. So this tendency may remain and some data may be very well underreported. There was recently a warning from the Prime Minister, that's the name of the Chinese Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, that those local authorities who are caught doing such underreporting on purpose might face some difficult times. The situation of silent carriers is also a tricky issue. Right, China has started publishing now figures about silent carriers. At the peak of the epidemic, they had up to 43,000 silent carriers. Now it's a mere 1,000, 1,500. It's very, very little because they do not test systematically the whole population. They test only when symptoms appear. So those silent carriers which have been tested is just because they were neighbors or in the surrounding of people actually testing positive with symptoms. So they were tested together with the rest of the infected people. Now, based on Wuhan survey, because in Wuhan, because it was the center of the epidemic, there were far more tests conducted than anywhere else. It is estimated that between 0.15 and 0.3% of the population may be a silent carrier, which leads to very significant numbers. Now, one thing which is worth mentioning also is that not all deaths intervening over a 2 to 3 months period could be attributed to coronavirus, to COVID. The Chinese mortality rate is 0.74%, according to the, I think it's the UN. So over 2.5 months, among 1.2 billion people, this would mean 1.85 million deaths. So you have to bear this in mind when you read story about urns being circulated and given back in huge number to families in Wuhan. These urns correspond to a population of several dozen million people too. Now, why such low level, right? In Beijing, the number of deaths has not evolved very much since the beginning of the epidemic, but the number of sick persons has not evolved either. Mortality rate in Beijing is 2%, 2%. For China, it's overall China, it's 4%. In Wuhan was between 6 and 7%. These low levels, I think, can attribute it to a few very simple factors: early response and reactivity, systematic testing, if there are symptoms, immediately in hospital, population is disciplined, population is protected, and this was important, I think. The country was at a standstill when it occurred because of the New Year's. So what the Chinese authority had to do was to extend the period where no one was working, which is far easier than to stop everyone and prevent anyone from working. I'm afraid that if the epidemic had occurred at a different point in time, in May, in November, when they are afraid the second wave may occur, it could be far more difficult to contain the spread from the beginning. But this is just guessing. Now, before turning the economy, some figures to fix the levels of what we are talking about. I put this here because frankly speaking, I must confess I had no idea myself about what were the amount involved in GDP. So you see that China, this is nominal, right? It's not purchasing power parities, etc. It's just accounting. China is a little bit more than half of the EU and the US, with 14 trillion US dollar GDP. It's huge amounts, right? Trillion US dollar, it's a million times a million. France is a little baby there with 2.7 trillion. This is important, I think, these figures to bear in mind when you hear about 500 billion euros plan or 100 billion euros subsidies, and bear in mind that GDPs are really huge amounts. Can China global influence increase because of this crisis? For me, my answer, but I'm not a super specialist of this question, but my answer is yes. It's yes for at least these 5 reasons. And here again, this is my analysis, right? It's not the analysis of a very powerful consulting firm. But China's global influence will increase because, one, China is not isolated politically or economically. It has its own network, and this network is impressive. I mean, it started developing a little bit less than 20 years ago. And now you have, for example, the BRICS countries. BRICS, you know, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I mentioned the BRICS because they just issued Corona bonds. They didn't need to wait until the approval by whatever instant. They just issued Corona bonds, not huge amount, right? I think it's 500 or 700 million euros equivalent. But what is interesting is that these Corona bonds were issued in renminbi yuan, not in dollars. In the China network, you have also the Belt and Road initiatives. That's 70 countries, which China puts together, and for which there is a total of, I think, 22,000 projects which are being conducted for a huge number of $1 trillion. There is something which is called the 17+1, that China network and 17 Central and East European countries. They have their specific groups with China. They have also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is China and all countries in Central Asia, plus Russia. So this network is impressive and it's functioning. And China is more and more the leader on this in this congregation of countries. Second factor about China's global influence, possible increase in the aftermath of the COVID. China enterprises and individuals, they had cash in hand when the crisis occurred. And the analysts say that for 60% of the Chinese enterprises, the cash they had represented 3 months of turnover. So the Chinese government, in its economic promotion or recovery effort, could focus on forward-looking initiatives and not only on emergency reward or just trying to avoid the most dramatic consequences and mobilizing all efforts on these short-term initiatives. Of course, they did for short-term, right? And it's billions of yuan to the provinces, which bear the bulk of the cost when it comes to education and when it comes to unemployment benefits. They did, but they still have a lot of possibility to maneuver for strategic planning, and this will definitely influence the future. Three, China started recovering quickly, not only concerning the virus itself, but also economically, and this set an example which could be followed by other countries. There is of course, there was a big shock at the beginning of the outbreak of the epidemic. The industrial output decreased by 13 to 13.5% of previous year. Imagine, it's a huge decrease, right? In February, and the retail sales decreased to 20% of the level of the previous year. But at the end of March already, 80% of the joint venture companies were back to normal, according to a survey by a Japanese consultancy firm. And there is an index which shows the level of economic activity. It's called the Capital Economics Index. Capital Economics is a UK-based firm. The index will drop to 22% of 2019 in February. So we are more or less at the same level of disarray, but it was back to 60%, 60, already early in April, and the normal is expected for July, which is really a quick recovery, which will give China some advance vis-a-vis other countries. Why will China increase its influence? Because the China government and the Chinese firms are quite widely seen as helping hands in this crisis. You heard, I'm sure, that countries like Italy and Serbia say that China was the only country which actually helped them when they most needed it in the recent past. And I mention here Chinese firms because Alibaba, which is a huge company of China, which interestingly, Alibaba was created during the SARS crisis as a response to the confinement measures which were already taken. Alibaba, which is one of the biggest companies in the world, is the most prominent support to African economies at this point in time. China has exported in March only 1.5 billion US dollars value of medical material. All these things will be remembered by their partners. And finally, renminbi assets in this period of uncertainty are seen as a safe haven by several, and this would help speed up renminbi. Renminbi, it's the Chinese yuan, right? It's their currency. This would help speed up the internationalization of renminbi, which started in 2016 and is certainly not anecdotic. Plus, since other countries cannot deliver, a lot of orders will come to China, punctually first, and then probably more as a global partners, because they will be the only one for a certain number of weeks capable to respond to strong demands from ailing countries outside. So this was basically my presentation, right? And as a kind of conclusion, I just wrote here that time should definitely be over when looking on China was possible or fashionable. China knows it, right? They are a little bit amazed as some of the criticisms they hear. The two Chinese characters I wrote on the top, Xiaokan, this is the way looking down upon in Chinese, and it means small vision. So I hope in our countries, and I hope our leaders will not have a too persisting narrow vision when they deal with China. I think it would be a big mistake. So this was my presentation. I kept it short. I don't know if it was really short, but I thought time for discussion might be the most interesting part.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Victor. It was really very interesting, and to me, at least, eye-opener. There are so many things I didn't know that were happening there, and I make a parallel with some other crises that have happened, like the 2008 financial crisis, that were many enterprises that were too big to fail. And now I see that this is a country that was a little bit too big to fail, but on the other hand, had fundamentals that were really very strong, that allowed the country to react in such a surprising way. So I would have myself many questions, but I think I will have Manuela, who will manage the whole Q&A session to let us know how we're going to work and to lead it. Please, Manuela.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Just as a reminder to everybody, to put some order in the discussion, please write your question on the chat column. By opening it on the right, you have a small chat symbol at the bottom of your black screen. At the beginning, I'm pretty sure that we will have one or two questions that we can take separately. But if there are some common connections among the questions, of course, I will try to regroup them to facilitate Jean-Victor's reply. But we will do that in a very spontaneous way. So this is not an academic setting. I don't know if there are already some questions. Maybe Alejandro, you would like maybe to flag the first one. I have also my own questions that I will keep for the end, just to launch the discussion. Maybe Alejandro?
Go ahead by all means, Manuela, please.
There is a question by Vlasta. Thank you for this extremely insightful presentation. Indeed, I agree. Really much appreciated. Yes, you spoke about orders coming to China on a short and maybe long-term basis. And at the same time, there are voices in Europe and in the US to move production of strategic products like medical supplies, etc., back to our country for strategic purposes. What is your opinion on this sort of comments and situation? Over to you, Jean-Victor.
I think one of the main reasons why Europe has difficulties to react is the fact that, yes, they abandoned They abandoned the production of key strategic products. And I don't know if age is a privilege, but at least age goes with memories. In the 70s in France, there were some politicians which used to say that if France is the best in producing only ballpoints and bras, then we should produce only ballpoints and bras. And this is completely wrong. I mean, the production of strategic goods should be really available in the countries where they will be used. This is a lesson we learned a long time ago about energy, right? And in France, in the 60s, the main issue in putting so much emphasis on the development of nuclear plants was to give France its energetic autonomy. So there is no contradiction. I mean, there are so many products and which can be used and imported, exported, that it's not because strategic goods will be produced again in the countries which will need them most directly that you cannot have an expansion of trade overall and globally. So the two, I mean, the two things are to be conducted together. We are in a situation in France where you heard our president, right, yesterday. I mean, you heard or you didn't hear, but you know that our president already knows when we will be out of confinement. He doesn't know how, right? That's terrible. I mean, that's terrible. And they knew about the crisis on, if you remember the dates I put on the screen, on 3 January. We didn't make a single progress on the production of protective equipment, except some people just suing from home and delivering it to the city halls. It's like this in my village, right? There is, if you want, if you need, you go to city hall and you put your name on the list and someone will sue for you from home. And we are number 6 economy in the world. So, I mean, I fully agree that we have to increase and to repatriate strategic production of strategic goods. It doesn't mean that we will stop ordering important things from China. I don't think masks are the most important item in Chinese import-export balance, frankly speaking.
Thank you, Jean-Victor. I have one question, 2 questions actually, more or less related to the sanitary aspect of the situation. The first one from Yvonne, and then I have another question from Yvonne that I will try to link. But the first one is on if you have any data on the percentage of the group immunity in China. And a question from Enrique. And many people are saying that the pandemic is a kind of bacteriological war created and orchestrated by China in order to defeat Occident. What is your opinion on that? And then maybe the second question of Ivana could be related. There is many news, data, or perhaps speculation about the virus, so that people with diabetes, morbid obesity make the cases worse. Perhaps the general health in Wuhan is also better. Also, another theory talked about is that general life expectancy might be lower in some countries, and therefore, since the morbidity of the virus is mainly on the people aged 80s and above, perhaps that explains the lower amount of deaths in Wuhan. So do you know what is the situation on Wuhan's life expectancy? And I will stop here for the time being.
I will start with the China virus war. I think China doesn't need a virus to defeat Western countries if they think like this. Right? About the prevalence, right? This is the first question, right? The prevalence. The Chinese are indeed worried about a second wave, which may occur, they say, in October, November, right? Just because the prevalence is very low, right? When that's one of the big contradiction in these actions that are taking to avoid the spreading of the disease, which is if people are confined, quarantined, and well protected, they don't get infected. But if they don't get infected, then they are vulnerable. And China is still now, they are okay if they are among themselves, but they block all incoming flights. They just repatriate their own citizens from abroad, and the whole fuss about the new surge of the cases is just 100 cases. It was 2 flights coming, one from the UK and one from Russia, one from the UK, sorry, one from the US, Chinese students coming back to their home. And in these 2 flights, there were altogether 109 students were infected when in their countries of origin. So immediately they are quarantined. Even if not infected, they are quarantined, etc., etc. So yes, the virus has not reached to the overall population, and that's why they are afraid that there might be in autumn when they will have to reopen the frontier. I mean, I just hope if my government lets me go out, I hope I can come back, right? And they are afraid when they reopen their borders that there might be a second wave. The only solution is vaccination, or curing. But the prevalence rate, it's not very high in China. The other question was about life expectancy in Wuhan. I have no idea about in Wuhan specific. I could find, right? But Chinese life expectancy is among the highest in the world. And China is an aging country now, not as much as Japan, but comparable to Europe. So it's not because the population is very young that the number of cases, of fatal cases, were very low. I mean, it's just you have to look after it for other reasons. Wuhan is a very old city. It's not one of these booming cities like Shenzhen and around Hong Kong, which there actually you could say the population is very young and then recovers very quickly. Wuhan is it's a very ancient city where the population is not really young. I mean, there are as many. Now, what happens is that in the Chinese culture, prevention is a very, very important factor of daily life. Their medicine, traditional medicine, which is very strong, right, and still preferred by many, many Chinese people. In traditional Chinese medicine, when the role of the doctor is to avoid that the disease comes. Curing is just when you failed. So this may have played a role in the way the Chinese people are treating the epidemic situation. They really abide and they understand, and probably they are also, when it comes to diabetes or all other illnesses that are considered as potentially aggravating the individual situation, they may take better care of their health than some of the Westerners with the same affection.
Jean-Victor. Enrique asked a question about this conspiracy theory of the bacteriological war generated by China to dominate the Occident, and then you said, well, China doesn't need that. Could you please elaborate a little bit on your opinion in this regard?
No opinion. I mean, why should China launch a bacteriological war? Why? I mean, that's. But as soon as this rumor arrived, they spread a counter rumor. You heard this, yeah, right? That the virus actually was coming from the US.
May I explain my question, please?
Yes, Enrique, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, it's mainly in America, and particularly in Latin America, and more specifically in my country of origin, Colombia. It's amazing how this idea is spread over there. People are believing firmly that this is a war started by China to win the economic competence with the rest of the world. Of course, this originates in points presented by Mr. Trump. He was the originator of this theory.
Yes, I mean all the theories about about China hiding, China comploting, whatever. You have two sources basically. One is Falun Gong, which is this sect which is well known, and the other is Radio Free Asia, right, which is also known for its interest in China. Now you can do absolutely nothing against these rumors. I mean, there is in Wuhan a laboratory which is specialized in viruses, and the idea was that the virus was produced in this laboratory, and then there was a leak and whatever. And it didn't help that the people in Wuhan, the government of Wuhan, explained that this laboratory is not working on this type of viruses, but on far more dangerous ones. Doesn't help. People don't listen. I mean, those who have no interest in listening don't listen. What I just wanted to say is that China is winning the competition, right? And they didn't need this type of things. Killing your clients is not a very good strategy when you want to win trade war. But of course, I cannot give you any guarantee about this not being the case. I have no idea, right? I'm sure it makes no sense, but who am I? I mean, to compete with Falun Gong and Radio Free Asia.
Thank you. I fully agree with you. I don't believe in this theory, but it is a rumor that is being consistently transmitted throughout the world, particularly in America, also in Latin America. It may do a lot of damage.
Yeah, but I don't know to whom, right? But what is true, I mean, it may do a lot of damage to mankind because distrust is not very good. But it's true that China is seen as a threat by some economic circles just because it doesn't share their approach of the world, let's say. One thing I did not mention in my talk, for example, is that I mentioned about the China network, right, all these countries. What I did not mention is that the Chinese leaders are on a daily basis in contact, in exchanging with their partners in the other countries, sharing with them information about which decisions they are considering and what will happen and what are their needs. And they know how to do things. They know. And it's not, I mean, it's not the type of country which would jeopardize decades of efforts to improve ties and relationships just to kill half of mankind in order to be considered as the undebatable leader of the other half. Those who propagate these rumors, I mean, they have, for example, for sure their own agenda, right? But those who listen to these rumors, maybe they could get a little bit better acquainted with China before paying any credit to this. But it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because you never know. I mean, what result it can provide.
Thank you, Jean-Victor. I have another interesting question from Federica, and I fully share with her the concern because I am also Italian and I'm also very much attached to Spain. She's living in Spain. I grew up in Spain, so we have a connection there. And the concern is because of the decision taken yesterday by the Spanish government to reopen at least the non-essential activities, economic activities suddenly. Which has meant a 40% increase in presence in the transportation in Madrid's area, for instance, today, which is the most affected zone in Spain. While at the same time in Italy, we are still discussing when and how to open what. So I would like your views in light of the Chinese experience, of course, but obviously we are talking about different data in terms of cases and deaths. How is your vision on that?
Yeah, I heard, I listened to our president yesterday, and he said, after we get out of confinement, then we will give masks to the population, right? That's absolutely, this is what is threatening, right? In China, when they reopened progressively the activity, there was a time when they said, okay, now we have extended work, we have extended the New Year holidays it's enough now, you should go back to work, the situation is under control, etc. This was mid-March, something like this. But since 23 January, right? Everywhere in China, there were temperature controls at the entrance of all metro stations, at the entrance of all supermarkets, at the entrance of all living compounds. Everyone was wearing a mask since 23 January. And this is how you do things. There were very specific guidelines given to the firms and the enterprises on when they resume activities. You need to have so much, not less than 1 meter between two workers. If you are in office and accommodated in a building, the people on the lift should not be closer than 1 meter from each other. And in all the lifts, they traced squares on the floor of the lift. And there was someone at the gate of every lift and every floor to be sure that you had no more, if it's a lift for 4 in terms of crisis, even though the capacity is 12, you don't put 4, more than 4, right? 1 per square meter. And all of them, of course, with masks. So if you don't have this, right, saying, okay, you can, we can start progressively opening the factories and whatever, yes, you will have more and more cases. In fact, what I believe is that in our countries, people, the leaders don't tell it too much. But what I believe is that we are trying to reach, we are basing the end of the epidemics on reaching the strategic threshold of contamination of the population. They want to get as close as possible to the 60%, hoping that most of the infected people, since they talk about active generation, most of the infected people will be cured quite easily because the virus is not too much deadly for them. I'm not convinced that all our governments have a clear strategy like China has, just because they lack the infrastructure, they lack the equipment, and maybe they don't have it's too late. I mean, it's too late. The action could have been taken far earlier. It's an impossible task now to control this when the first decisions came in, when the spreading of the virus was already so active. When China, sorry, I'm too long, but when China started its measures, right, 26 January, at that time, for the whole of China, there were less than 2,000 cases, the vast majority in Wuhan. So they declared the confinement at a time where infection was just starting, not after it was too late. On 15 March in France, when we started thinking about closing the bars and still going to the polls, we had already 6,000 cases declared, right, registered in France, 3 times as much as China when they declared the stage of emergency action. So it's very difficult to catch up when you start late, right? And yes, it's scaring, but maybe this is the best way to reach an optimum rate of prevalence, but it will have a human cost.
Thank you, Jean-Victor. I would like to open again the floor for other questions or comments on any topic that was discussed already, or a new topic maybe.
May I?
Sure, Alejandro, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Victor. Thank you very much for the questions of all of you. I have 2 questions. One that I think that is cultural, and I think it might be an easy one, and one that might be a bit more difficult. I start with the easy one. The easy one is that, as we understand here in Switzerland, all this started in Wuhan because people are eating at the markets bumps or some kind of animals. Is there any indication that this practice will change? Or I was wondering myself, they have been eating the same kind of animals for so many years. Do you have any information on why something happened now? Because they've done the same thing for animals for ages, possibly 1,000 years, I mean. That's the easy one. If you want to react, Jean-Victor.
Yeah, it's easy to answer, but it's not easy to act on it. The animal was pangolin, in fact. It's not the bat, they drop it. After I think it's after the H1N1 or another pandemic, China took the decision already that from now on we will never eat wild animals again, etc., etc., etc. And it lasted for, they issued decrees and provisional orders, that's how they called it, right? It lasted 3 months, right? And then people started again. The main problem is that it's not that you eat pangolin. I mean, it's not nice to eat pangolin for the pangolin, right? But the main problem is that there is no health control, right? And if you visit some of these Chinese markets, it's really Chinese people, they say, okay, we may be the second economy in the world, or we may be the first, but we are still a country under development. And when you visit some of their markets, it's true that it's a bit strange. I mean, so what they may do they have already said never more, we will never more eat wild animals, etc., etc. But they will. Right? But what could happen, I say could, in an optimistic way, is a better control about the health situation on these markets. And I'm a bit optimistic because they managed to control a number of things like this. You have visited China, Alejandro, right?
Yes, indeed, many times.
So you were probably visiting the silk market in Beijing, and it was a mess, complete mess, etc. At one stage, they said, we cannot continue like this, with this complete mess. So they closed everything. They built a very nice compound, and they called back the people to sell. And now they sell in a better environment, and a monitored environment. And at the same time, maybe they could just catch some of the people who don't want to pay taxes. But they may be prompted to act on the sanitary conditions of some of their markets. The cultural factor is also that Chinese people, some Chinese people, most of the elder generation, let's say, they don't want to eat things which are dead, right? They want to see the animal killed. So you have these markets which, the pangolin you see on the markets, they are alive. They are not dead, right? The fish you buy, they are alive, they are not dead. This is changing with I mean, you know that you have many supermarkets in China now. You have Carrefour, you have Walmart, you have Korean and whatever, where you have frozen fish, frozen meat, and whatever. So the habits are changing. But when people go to the market, like the WUHAN thing, they want to see live animals. And these live animals have never been controlled by a veterinarian, and they are killed under conditions which are a bit not very protective. So I forgot the question, but I think the answer is probably they will continue.
Yes. Yeah.
But there may improve the environment where this happens.
Yeah, the thing, because we were all surprised by having this COVID-19 coming from that origin, but we were wondering, in Mexico, we also eat some strange things. If this wouldn't happen in next year with COVID-21 or COVID-22, because we continue to eat these kind of things. And
it depends how these things are killed and where is the control. Is there a veterinarian control? And how is the market where they are sold?
Yes. When I was in Beijing, I went for 4 years in a row to lecture in Beijing. And the main difference was when I was alone on myself and with foreigners, we went to restaurants that foreigners could understand. And when were Chinese locals who invited me, they took me to places where I had to choose which fish to kill. Mm-hmm. They show it to me, and this is the one I want to kill. And there's a kind of an experience. But now, possibly the second one that you have not touched with, and this brings me back to our colleague Giovanni Tamburi, another Italian. You remember him at Social Security?
Of course.
He frequently said, I want to see the earth and things as if I came from another planet. And if I now look at the planet Earth and I see Chinese people, they were so successful in reacting to this COVID. They are big successful in the world economy. They became from really far back to become the second world's economy. They're really very influential. So this means that this is the way that the others should follow, in particular because there's the issue of expression of democracy, of human rights and other things that are mentioned in the rest of the world. And in Western countries, many mention, well, this is the price that we are paying for having democracy. We have governments that just came into power 2 or 3 years ago, that they are new ones in doing things, and we have governments that will change every 4 to 5 years. So that's a little bit the price. So as coming from another planet, maybe we're paying a too big of a price, or what would be your thoughts on this?
One thing first. First thing is, you are right in saying that we change governments very often, and that this doesn't help, etc. This is right. Now, in France, we had the habit of changing government very often for a long time. But in the past, we had a national commissary for planning, which was more powerful than any ministry. And this was under General de Gaulle, who was not a very strong communist. It's not because you change government very often that you cannot plan, that you cannot get ready, and that you cannot have strategic planning. So I don't think that's a quid pro quo between democracy and success. I mean, that's it would be a nonsense. But the problem is that maybe we don't understand very well what democracy could be. I hear a lot of words these days that henceforth nothing will be as before, and plus jamais ça, and all this. And in fact, it's business as usual. You hear the enterprises, the first thing they say, oh, you will have to work harder, right, in future. And you hear listen to our president yesterday, he did all good. He is perfect, as usual. He has been perfect, right? Sometimes some made mistakes, but not him, never. So there is something wrong in the way maybe some of our countries are dealing with democracy, which is not really democracy, but that's another discussion, right? Now, should we be like China in our countries? I don't think so. We cannot. We cannot be like China, right? But just because 60 million French people, it's the total number of those in Hubei province, right? That's if we were China, we would need to find sort of 30 other provinces to reach the strategic dimension. And we would need to have suffered a lot in the past, right? To have, we would need to have had Japanese war. We would need to have had the Long March. We would need to have had the Red Guards and people dying from hunger and whatever. We cannot be China, and it would not be good. But probably we have to learn. I mean, why is it that democracy could jeopardize health and economic progress? No reason, but maybe we don't have the right democracy. That's another story.
Thank you, Jean-Victor.
Jean-Victor, thank you. I have a question, which is in fact two questions from Federica. The first part refers to the electronic monitoring of the population. And by the way, I just wanted to alert Federica that the first great talk that we did was with two Singaporean friends that precisely focused on electronic monitoring in Singapore. So we have a similar question, similar situation here in China. But the second one is even more interesting, I think, in the context of this discussion. It is the issue of the social credit system as a way to punish those that violate, for instance, health regulations. So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on that, Jean-Victor.
Yes. It's a system which was introduced in China recently, maybe 1 year, 1.5 years ago. And if someone perpetrates an offense, something which is against what is considered proper rules of the society, his initial credit is decreased, right? And if you go too low in your credit, then there is a case to bring you to court and to be a little bit more severely punished. They started experiencing this in the bicycle rentals. When you know that in China you have for a long number of years now, you have these bicycles you take where you want, you live where you want, and it's almost free. And when you start joining a scheme, you join with points, 100 points. If you leave your bicycle in a place where it's not authorized to leave the bicycle, you lose 10 points, etc. And if you are below a certain number of points, because of too many offenses, then, well, you are banned from the scheme. You cannot rent a bicycle anymore. So it's more or less the same. And all this is made possible just because they have everything goes through the cell phone. So they know. I mean, they know very well where you are, what you do, etc. So the social credit, it's something which is new, right? I heard that in France we have this. It's not. We had the system now of when you don't have the right paper and you go outside to walk your dog and you are caught 4 times, you are on trial, right? And you risk to have I don't know how many months in prison and how many thousand euros to pay as a fee. It's a bit more violent or a bit less insidious. I don't know. This type of social credit schemes is, frankly speaking, even after 30 years, it's hard for me to understand that why it's needed. There are things in China I don't understand why they need this, really. But they do, and it's not really questions. Maybe one day it will disappear. But it's strange. I mean, let's say it's strange. It's a logical consequence of the system and of the also the technology which allows to do this. But it's strange. They go very far now in the use of the cell phone. My friend told me she had to go with her neighbor, old persons, right? She agreed to take them to the countryside to see the flowers and whatever. And they live in Beijing, in suburb of Beijing. They had to be very, very careful in not crossing the border of the next province. Because if they wanted to see, they are close to the border, right? And if they want to see the flower in the other province, when they come back, their cell phone tracking shows they have been in the other province. So the police would come and tell them, now you have to stay quarantined for 14 days because you left Beijing. So it's very efficient, but it's scary a little bit, right? And I'm not sure it's fundamental, honestly. That's the point, right? You know why Chinese bicycles don't have lights on it? It's because Mao Zedong decided that public electricity on the street was a priority for China. Then bicycles don't need to have lights. And it's still the same. There are things which are imposed. You don't know why, but they stay. And that's one of the rigidities of the system. I don't want to say China knows it all far better than anyone, right? I just wanted to say that there are things they do and they do very well. And we should probably get some inspiration, but they don't do everything very well at all. That's not true.
Thank you, Jean-Victor. I think Alejandro has another question. Alejandro, your mic.
Sorry very much. Yes, thank you very much, Manuela. I read, of course, with lots of interest the paper that you sent us and that was available in our webpage. And you mentioned there that there is no sense of panic, and actually the leader Xi Jinping, he has only appeared very calmly 3 times during the whole crisis to the public, which is really a contrast of what's going on in France.
Oh, yes.
They go every month, and in the United States every day. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I asked my contacts, right? Is it true that Xi Jinping, etc., etc.? And they said, yes, he's working. The rest of the time, he has other things to do. And they don't want to hear talks by Xi Jinping. They want to see their community leader acting, following the instructions from the center. That's another. I mean, Xi Jinping would never speak half an hour on TV just to tell, that, for example, to tell that the schools will reopen on 11 May and that but we are sure of it, but we don't know how. Xi Jinping would never say this, never. And the schools are reopening and he didn't mention it. That's not his job. So, yes, it's something else. It's another world, It's another party also, right? It's something else. China has a very strong communist party with its rules and its way of working. This may be important also. Right?
Of course.
In the sense of discipline and how things are organized.
Thank you, Jean-Victor.
Thank you so much, Jean-Victor. We have already, we are out of time. In fact, it's 6:32. But I wonder if there are other important questions. If not, I would like to take advantage of the fact that I have the floor and I am the disc jockey, apparently, for a final comment from my perspective, and then I will give the floor again to Alejandro to conclude. When I was a student at university here in Geneva, I had a professor teaching, of course, what I'm supposed to know, international relations and particularly geopolitical history and so on. And when it came to China, he used to put a huge picture of the Chinese wall on the back of the classroom, but a huge one, just a huge one. And whenever there was a specific question or a difficult question from the students to him regarding a Chinese issue, he used not to reply, but just to show the Chinese wall on the wall of the classroom and to say, you just look at it, you see how big it is, how old it is, where this is the Chinese vision, the long-term vision of China. And I fully agree with your comments regarding the leadership, the Chinese leadership that will certainly be increased and accelerated at the global level thanks to the pandemics, because I'm fully convinced that the Chinese government within the long-term vision will use the pandemics as an instrument of its own foreign policy and to use it in addition to whatever were already the roots of the recent expansion of the Chinese presence in the international system. So when you said the narrow vision as compared to the long-term big vision of China, I think this is absolutely appropriate, and the pandemics fits very well within that Chinese wall long-term vision that is still in my mind whenever I think about the Chinese mindset. I don't know if you agree with that, but anyway, this is just what I wanted to flag and to share with you. And
no,
thank
that's
you again, Jean-Victor.
Yeah. No. I fully agree. I mean, long-term perspective, and they are lucky because in this period. I mean, they are not lucky. It's not luck, but they are fortunate that in this period they can focus on long-term, right? They don't have to colmater les brèches. I mean, that's very different. That's a very strong advantage, but it's nothing. It's not chance. It's not by chance, right? Long term is yes. They have a long-term vision. I fully agree.
Over to you, Alejandro.
Well, many things have been said, and this is, as always, a very, very interesting presentation and sharing of issues by Jean-Victor Gruat. It was really very interesting because he took us from economic to cultural to structural issues and everything, looking it from his double perspective as a European living in China, knowing China perfectly, and knowing Europe and having this mix of European values and Chinese evolution. So really, thank you very much, Jean-Victor, for this presentation. Thank you very much, Manuela. Thank you very much to all the participants. I would like to thank particularly, now that I have her on the screen, to Virginia Umut Guerrero, who joined us, and we are extremely happy to have you with us. And our prayers and thoughts have been with you recently, so we are together and we are extremely happy to have you on board again. Thank you very much, Jean-Vic. I hope this is not the last time that we participate together in an activity. Now you know that we are here in Geneva. If you happen to come here beyond the confinement or within the confinement to our future great talks. So thank you very much to everyone. If you arrived late to this session, don't worry, everything has been recorded and it will be available as tonight or tomorrow morning in our website. Thank you very much and good evening to all of you. Thank you, Jean-Victor.